Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's conversation with Mayukh Sen and Monique Truong. We are so thrilled to have you all join us here as we celebrate Mayukh's new book, Tastemakers: 7 Immigrant Women Who Revolutionized Food in America. My name is Lily Philpott. I am the programs manager at the Asian American Writers Workshop, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our virtual event space. A quick visual description of me. I have short black hair that is pinned back, round glasses with black frames, red lipstick, and I am wearing a black turtleneck sweater. Behind me, you can see a number of paintings and my bookshelves. Please do say hi and let us know in the chat where you're watching from. I am speaking to you today from Brooklyn, New York, which is on ancestral and unceded Munsee, Lenape, and Canarsie lands. For those of you who are new to the AAWW, we are a national nonprofit organization dedicated to uplifting Asian diasporic literature and storytelling. We hold frequent readings and conversations like this one, organize community arts programming in New York City high schools and senior centers, run fellowship programs for emerging writers of color, and also publish an award-winning online literary magazine, The Margins. This year, we are thrilled to be celebrating our 30th anniversary with a campaign we launched in October, AAWW at 30. AAWW at 30 will explore the values and ideas that lie at the heart of the workshop's mission. From the need for an artistic home to interrogating our editorial and archival legacies, which Monique will be joining us in doing, this campaign will serve not only as a retrospective of our rich and layered history, but also as a resounding call to envision our future. Programs like this wouldn't be possible without the support of our community. You can donate to support many more years of the workshop and all our programs, the link in the Zoom chat. And we hope you'll join us online as we continue to celebrate this fall. You can also visit us at aaww.org or follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, where the recording of this event will be posted. During the event, we ask that all audience members practice nonviolence in the chat. Comments that are racist, transphobic, homophobic, ableist, and/or misogynist will be flagged, and the person will be removed from this event. We will open our event with a reading from Tastemakers. I'll introduce Mayukh and Monique briefly, and then we'll turn the mic over to Mayukh. Mayukh Sen is a James Beard and IACP award-winning writer based in Brooklyn. His work has been anthologized in 2 editions of The Best American Food Writing, and he teaches food journalism at New York University. Monique Truong is the Vietnamese-American author of the award-winning novels The Book of Salt, Bitter in the Mouth, and The Sweetest Fruits. She is a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, US-Japan Creative Artists Fellowship, NYPL Young Lions Fiction Prize, Penn Robert W. Bingham Fellowship, Bard Fiction Prize, and the Asian American Literary Award, among others. She is also a former refugee, an essayist, a lyricist, librettist, children's book author, avid eater, and intellectual property attorney, more or less in that order. I do want to mention that she is also a co-editor of the AAWW anthology Watermark, which is a collection of Vietnamese American poetry and prose, and is being reissued by Texas Tech University Press and DVAN in spring of 2023. Thank you all again so much for being here, and please join me in welcoming Mayukh to read from Tastemakers. Thank you.
Hello, thank you all so much. Thank you, Lily, for that lovely introduction, and thank you, AAWW, for having me today. I should preface all of this by saying that my late father admired AAWW's work so tremendously, and he always wanted me to get involved with it in some capacity. So to be here tonight, I'm quite touched and honored, and I wish he were alive to see this. So thank you so much for making this happen. A quick visual descriptor for anyone who may need it of me. I have black hair shaved on the sides and back, wear glasses. I am brown and Bengali, wearing a gray sweatshirt. Behind me, you can see my fridge, dishwasher, pull-up bar. I'm in my studio apartment in Brooklyn. Amazing. Okay, so I'm going to read a portion from the introduction to my book, Tastemakers. So here we go. Hopefully it won't take too long. One question may hang over you as you read this book. Why is a man writing this? It's a justified question. I'm aware that I present as a cis male to the public, and I prefer to use the privileges afforded to me because of that to amplify the voices of women whom our cultural attention skews away from. I'm sensitive to the limits of this very hand, which is why I feel it is crucial to decenter myself in the process of writing rather than interject or cast judgment on my subjects. The more elaborate response I have to such a concern is that I, like many queer identifying people, have had a complex, evolving relationship to gender expression throughout my entire life. I realize that my appearance might belie this tension. This project is intensely personal, forged by my own sense of isolation in this field as a queer person of color. I began writing about food professionally in 2016 when I was 24. Even then, I could sense that I was writing from a center of gravity that differed from those of my peers as a queer child of Bengali immigrants to America. Early in my career, perhaps these feelings directed my narrative gaze towards story subjects who, like me, once felt that they did not belong. These figures tended to be people of color, queer people, women, or immigrants. Often they were even part of more than one of those groups. Their trajectories invigorated me. They floated on the margins of the food world when they first landed in it, only to push their way to the center by sheer force. These subjects had something to say. They were persuasive enough to get powerful people to listen. With time, I would come to understand what it's like to have people reduce me to my identity. The very aspects of myself that once seemed like liabilities, my queerness, my color, also started to make me, in a word, marketable. Actual engagement with the substance of my work was suddenly secondary to those superficial factors. No matter the case, the acute sense of alienation I enter this industry with does not fade easily. There will always be a sliver of me that feels as though I'm on the margins of the food world, the margins of this country's dominant social structures. Maybe the answer to why I gravitate towards the stories of these women lies somewhere in my identity, how lonely I often feel because of it, and what I create from that solitude. Around the time I wrote this book, I also weathered two particularly difficult losses. I lost my father to cancer in 2017, and I lost a best friend to mental illness in 2020. These deaths weighed on me. I found myself forgetting so much about these people who'd been such vital presences in my own life, their voices, their mannerisms. I understood the fragility of memory, how easily the essence of a person can disappear once they're no longer around. Writing is one way of ensuring someone's story doesn't die along with them. The 7 women in this book have been my teachers. Through spending time with their stories, I've come to question and ultimately better understand my own place in America. I hope these women will inspire a similar journey for you. Thank you. That's enough of me.
Hi,
Hello.
Mayukh. Oh my God, that's so beautiful. I love your introduction so much. It is a masterwork, and I really I've had the great pleasure, as you know, of reading an advanced copy of your work. So in preparation for tonight, I reread your book, and the pleasure was really um intense, because it's so, I mean, if that introduction didn't already make it clear to folks out there why this work is so vital and why your voice is so is such a gift. I don't know how else, that could be made clearer. But hopefully tonight we'll really kind of bring it all home and encourage folks to really explore this book. So First, I am going to give a quick visual description of myself. I'm a Vietnamese American woman. I have medium length hair. It's parted in the middle. I'm wearing a navy blue dress with silvery lines, and I'm sitting on a muted green couch in my living room. And I'm in Brooklyn. Just next door to Mayukh, in fact. No, no, I have no idea where where you live, Mayukh.
I think we're in different neighborhoods. I'm in Williamsburg. Please
Oh.
don't judge me, anyone.
No judgment. I wanted to share with folks how we first met. And that was 2 years ago, where you very generously helped me launch my third novel into the world by having a public conversation with me on the stage of the Center for Fiction. And, you know, when my publishers asked me who I wanted to be in conversation with that night, I thought of you immediately. And it's because your essays about food and foodways have everything that I respect most in writing, which is an engaging narrative voice, the ability to marshal complicated, complex facts and issues, and then bring them all together in a way that clarifies and challenges, right? And what you do, Mayukh, with the, as you touched upon in the introduction, the subject matters that you choose to write about, what they do is they hold a mirror back at us, and they basically ask us, how will we interact and be in the world differently? And I think that that makes your writing deeply and necessarily radical. And
That's very high praise coming from you, not to interject. But
no,
so
no, go on, go on. Is what you should say.
From a writer of your caliber, that means a great deal to me. You know this, and I won't bore the audience too much with this love fest, but I've been a great admirer of your work for a very long time, and I teach it to my students now because it taught me so much. So I'm honored that you would read me with that kind of generosity. So thank you very much.
You are more than welcome. And Mayukh, I thought we could begin talking about your book tonight by doing a roll call of the 7 women who you write about, because I want to talk about them all, but my sense of, you know, we have an hour together, even less, right? And I'm not sure we'll get to everyone. So I want to honor them in this way first.
Yes, no, that's a wonderful question. Thank you. So the 7 women in my book, in order, Chaoyang Bouet, who was born in China, then Elena Zelayeta, who was born in Mexico, Madeleine Kamen, who was born in France, Marcella Hazan, who was born in Italy, Julie Sani, who was born in India, Najmi Badmanglij, who was born in Iran, and Norma Shirley, who was born in Jamaica. So those are the 7, but I could have written about so many more figures who have really changed the way that Americans cook and eat today. So it was tough to narrow down, certainly.
And that brings us very nicely to my first question for you, right? Which is in the part of the intro that you didn't read to us, you talk about why you want to shine a light on not just one individual, but on a group, right? A cross section. And you use the phrase collective labor, right? Which are words that are still so rarely seen in contemporary food writing. So I want you to begin by just talking more about this concept of collective labor and its importance to food and to your book.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for noticing that I, the whole idea of collective labor, felt like such a necessary and obvious framework for my book as I was working through drafts, because I was asking myself, what is it about the group biography as a form that attracts me uh, to this kind of writing? And I realized it was because of my own frustrations as someone who was working within food media, just seeing so many narratives that were fixated on the individual and
Mm,
positing sole individuals as the creators or revolutionaries of the American palate. And many of those names that are bandied about often are familiar to many Americans. Julia Child, for example, James Beard. There are other figures who have gotten their due many times over. Yet, in that sort of cultural fixation, so many other figures who have been really instrumental to the way that Americans cook and eat today become obscured. And so I wanted to honor the fact that the creation of the American palate, so to speak, if such a thing as a shared palate does exist on the national level, that was the creation of so many different figures and so many different immigrant women in particular, not all of whom were necessarily honored in cultural memory in the way that they should have been. So even and as I was writing that in the introduction, I asked myself, well, how do I reconcile that kind of statement of purpose with the fact that these figures do focus, or these chapters, excuse me, do focus on individuals because these are biographical essays. And so within each of those chapters, I did my best, and you pushed me, Monique, to do this as well, as we were talking as I was writing this book, to really make sure that I'm honoring everyone else who worked in the same era as these women, or before these women, because, for example, the subject of one of my chapters, Julie Sani, who was born in India, there were other figures who were working around that same era that she began writing cookbooks. The most famous example might be Madhur Jaffrey, who's an actress and food writer. And I wanted to make sure that I was not erasing figures like Madhur Jaffrey and others while positioning Julie Sani in the way I was. And I think that I tried my best to apply that sensibility to each of my chapters so that readers could take a look at my book and say, why didn't you mention this person? Or why didn't you mention that person? Because that is a totally fair criticism.
mm, mm. Um, I'm, uh, I think that response really goes to, what I have always felt uncomfortable with, in terms of food media, right? And food writing, right? Which is this elevation. I mean, this is not a new thing, but but with food TV and all that, the celebrity status of the chef. And the chef, as you know, is often the white male, right? While everyone else in the kitchen disappears.
Exactly.
Right. And
And
yes.
no, I was just going to say that, it was fascinating to watch a lot of these conversations permeate the mainstream food media, for lack of a better term, last year. I think that the pandemic really did open the eyes of people who were at the very top of mastheads, let's say, very powerful institutions, to the fact that restaurants, for example, are the product of many people's labor, not just the genius of the chef who has access to publicity and easy access to capital and has so much visibility that others who have far less material power just do not have. And I wanted to apply kind of a similar philosophy to this book as well, in the sense that when you do focus on a figure like Madhur Jaffrey or Julia Child, who are the other minds who get obscured? And that is not to take away from the greatness of those aforementioned women like Mother Jeffrey, Julia Child. They should be celebrated, yes.
Mhm.
And yet I want readers to understand that the American mind has capacity to honor so many more than just these sole figures. And yet I realize that it's an uphill battle.
Right.
I have gotten a response from a reader already who read an excerpt of one of my chapters. And that person said, why, Mayukh, don't you think that this other person who wrote about this
Mm,
cuisine is more influential because her books were published in the UK and she had
mm,
television shows? And
mm.
that sort of response is precisely what I'm trying to write against in this book, yet I will likely still get it even after it's out. So I'll just have to live with that.
Well, you know, you have this what I think of as a directive to your readers, um, that you include in your introduction, which I find incredibly powerful, and it speaks, to your project. You write, I urge you to question, right? Which immigrant stories are American culture values versus those it tosses aside, and why, right? And this is what you're talking about here. Why do certain lives, certain achievements, float up and stay there? And why do we, in the in the passage of time or expediency, we forget other stories, right? And I think that's a powerful question to ask, whether the subject is food or, farming or architecture or anything else, right? So I wanted to kind of honor that spirit of your directive, right? And so to what I'd love to do is to concentrate my next few questions to you, um, on one of the women, who was entirely lost to me until I read about her in your book. And that's Chow Yang Bu. And well, I'll let you talk to us about her. And my question to you is, how did you first come to her? And how did you, um, uh, well, I mean, clearly something interested you and grabbed you about her. But I think what I'd love to also hear is what surprised you most as you started to get to know her life, on a deeper level.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So for viewers and listeners who might not be familiar with Chow Yang Bui's work, so she was a doctor who was born in China in the late 1800s, who came to America with her very famous linguist husband, Chow Yunren, and they came in the 1920s. And back in China, she had worked as a doctor. Yet, once she came to America for her husband's academic job, she realized that she was quite uncomfortable with English and she could no longer find work as a doctor in her new adoptive home. And so instead, she began to focus her energies on cooking. And that's a profession, food writing, that she fell into unexpectedly. And that brought her to her magnum opus, which was published in 1945, called How to Cook and Eat in Chinese. And it was arguably the first English language Chinese cookbook published in America that was truly, thoroughly systematic and exposed American readers to a side of Chinese cooking that went far beyond Cantonese cooking. And as a result, it was quite revolutionary for its era. It also you can see its imprint in the way that we talk about food today. I think that if anyone does know Bue's name, they know her because she is credited with introducing Americans to the term stir fry, which
Mm.
had not appeared in the American lexicon, at least to my knowledge and many other people's knowledge prior to that book. And so it was truly a groundbreaking text in its time. Yet that cookbook's genesis was really tortured, which fascinated me from a narrative perspective, because she was, as I said earlier, quite uncomfortable with communicating in English, whether it was verbally or on the page. And so after she wrote her first draft, her eldest daughter, who had been born in America, I believe, helped her kind of rework the language. And then her husband came in and said, no, this is all wrong. I'm going to rewrite this completely. And that the text itself teems with this sort of tension. There's so many footnotes that kind of contain evidence of this back and forth between husband and wife. Yet I think that where you see the anger, so to speak, from Bouet herself most clearly is in the introduction to the book, in which she declares, I'm ashamed to have written this book. And then she goes on to just describe that genesis that I was mentioning earlier and the very, very difficult process of putting this book to print. And I was so fascinated because this woman has been obscured in cultural memory to many people who do know what stir frying is. And I just thought that was so upsettingly paradoxical, this idea that, you know, so many Americans know what stir fry means. And it's that term itself has kind of taken on a life and meaning of its own. Yet they don't know the woman who was responsible for introducing Americans to that term. Yet her kind of disappearance from cultural memory was also in her actual story, in the sense that on the page, her husband, this man, overwrote her essentially, or at least that was my understanding of the story. And that is why I was so attracted to beginning my book with her story, because it really just, this literal kind of overwriting was also a metaphorical one. And I had encountered her story many years ago while reading a scholarly work called Chow Chop Suey by Anne Mendelsohn, which, you know, went into great detail about the making of this book. And I just remember putting that in my back pocket and saying, I need to write about this one day in some capacity. And in terms of what surprised me, I mean, there's a lot that surprised me about her story. I think that I think that the speed with which America kind of forgot her was the element that did surprise me the most, because her book, you know, it was published in 1945, and few truly significant English language texts about Chinese cooking in America have been published, you know, until the 1960s, I would say. Yet her book, you know, it still had stamina through the generations. Yet it was really in the 1970s when there were so many other figures in Chinese cooking in America who really rose to prominence. Cecilia Chang, for example, who passed away last year, I believe. She's one such figure, and there are many others. Martin Yan would come onto the scene in the 1980s. And I noticed how this kind of gallery of characters may have made America toss someone like Bouet aside with greater ease. And it reminded me that, you know, within the American imagination, there's often only room for one figure, especially when it comes to cuisines from, you know, outside of continental Europe. You know, only one person can kind of be the figurehead usually, because that's just the limited way that the American imagination works. And so that was, I would say, the most upsetting part of everything in her story.
Wow. Yes. I'll tell you that when I first, you open her chapter with that truly upsetting line that of hers, you know, that she's ashamed to write this book, right? But I'll to tell you that after finishing her chapter and really sort of understanding the full scope of her life, do you think that that was a bit of a humble brag on her part?
I couldn't tell because there was so much about that book that was also quite humorous. And I neglected to mention that 2 years after that book came out, it was so commercially successful that she also wrote an autobiography in which her humor comes through quite lucidly. And so she
Ah.
clearly was someone who had a pretty wonderful sense of humor. And that is something that worried me too as I was writing, because so much of the scholarly work that does exist on Bouet, and that cookbook in particular,
Mhm.
usually brushes off that aspect of the book, its creation. They say, oh, so funny, this marital tiff that we all see on the page, right? And I was I was horrified because I thought, wow, but we are literally seeing this husband overriding this woman, his wife, and I wanted to correct for that. Yet, one anxiety that I had as I was mapping out that chapter is that, am I taking this too literally and too seriously? Yeah, so it was definitely tough to balance, those kinds of sides that you point out of her personality with my contemporary read of, or present day read, excuse me, of that cookbook. And I think that sort of problem applies to the writing process of all of my chapters. It was, I had to constantly resist the temptation to graft my present day mores and values onto the stories of these women who were working in a completely different era and against a set of challenges that I just cannot imagine because I live in a different, version of America. So.
Right. Um, Mayukh, I have um I have this sense of Bouvet and also the Jamaican-born chef and restaurateur Norma Shirley, that in their lives, in particular, it seems to me there's this kind of really intriguing mix of class privilege, that they enjoyed in their country of origin, right? Um, which allowed them access to higher education, travel abroad, and I would have to say, I would have to imagine, and you tell me if you agree, that within them was a deep well of confidence, because of it, right? And then also mixed into that was, once they left their country, right? And their how there was, I think the word that I land on is necessity. It was the necessity of their gendered roles as wives and as mothers, that led them to be more engaged with cooking and writing about food, right? So there's that kind of interesting mix of privilege and necessity. And I'm wondering if you can talk about how your sense of how that informed the way that they approach food writing or cooking in Norma's case. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that you're exactly right that, you know, those two women in particular, and perhaps a few others in my book, they did have a degree of class privilege in their home countries that may have opened up access to certain opportunities that were not otherwise available to women of lower classes. Yet, circumstances shifted in some way when they arrived in America. For Bouet, certainly was the case that because of her limited possibilities in America due to her discomfort with the English language, all that she could really do with her time in this new country was cook and become a housewife, which she wrote in her autobiography was the last thing that she wanted to do with her life. The idea horrified her, yet she eventually grew to I believe, from my understanding, derive some pleasure from that in America. In Shirley's case, it was interesting because she came to America in the 1960s, and she had a nursing degree, and she had married an Englishman, and then they had come to America, and she was actually working in nursing and at an abortion clinic in New York. Yet her mind, in the off hours of the night especially, gravitated towards food. She would say that she often couldn't sleep at night, after these very exhausting hours because, her mind was racing with these thoughts of things that she wanted to cook. And so she would just get in the kitchen and begin experimenting. And eventually, I think that the financial security that her family possessed as a result of her husband's job in a similar line of work allowed her to ditch that job in nursing altogether and instead kind of strike out on her own and pursue cooking as a profession, even if that may not have been an option for a lot of women in a completely different scenario. So there definitely was a degree of privilege there. But it's fascinating that you see that sort of symmetry in both of those stories, because those are the two chapters that bookend the book, so bookend the book. I don't know how funny. um, but it's true, right?
Yeah.
Bouet's story begins and then Norma Shirley's story ends, and she died in 2010, yet there's so many similarities. And another, not to yap on too much, that I see is that both women to some degree resisted assimilation. Norma Shirley, she tried to open her own restaurants in New York in the early 1980s, and she wanted to cook according to her creative whims. She was a Black Jamaican woman who wanted to cook French cooking with a Jamaican accent, I believe is what she said once. Yet it was impossible for her to find and access capital and investors and others in the food establishment who would actually help her mount that project. So instead, what she did is that she basically said that she is not going to, suffer these indignities any longer in America. She returned to Jamaica, and that is where she became a huge star by opening her own restaurants, because she didn't necessarily face those burdens in Jamaica that she did in America. So.
Yeah, what really, was clear in the way that you wrote about Norma Shirley is that she wanted to cook food for Jamaicans, not for tourists, right? And I kind of, that's where I'm getting this idea that, her privilege, her class standing, really kind of informed that, right? Yes, it certainly, her husband's income allowed, a certain kind of foundation, that she can build upon, and then, and become this cook. But really, it seemed to have come from inside of her, this idea that, no, I'm not cooking for you.
Right.
I'm cooking for my people.
Exactly.
I'm guessing that maybe that's why Bouvet's book was so expansive, so thorough too.
Mm-hmm.
You think? Because there was no shame in that, even though she says she's ashamed, there's no shame in the way that she approaches her cuisine.
Exactly. Yes, there is no shame, which truly makes that text radical in its context. Because even then, America was still kind of slowly repealing the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act and so many other institutional forms of discrimination against Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans. And so for her to write something that was so proud and lacked any sort of shame surrounding her home country's cuisine, is really significant to me. And I really do wonder how that book would have read had she, written it in a different set of circumstances, because there's so many other talking points that are embedded in her other works, like that autobiography that I mentioned, for example,
Mm,
that are so fiercely resistant to this idea of assimilating into America, and that being the only path forward for American or immigrants to succeed in America, excuse me. She said that, for example, no matter what language she speaks, no matter how hard she tries to speak English, whatever she says comes out Chinese in spirit. That is how deep her connection to her home country runs. And for that to be published in writing in 1947, I mean, I'm
mm,
fascinated by that.
right. Yeah. So which brings me to a question that kind of brings that kind of let's bring this all back to the beginning of when you first came up with an idea for this book. I think you wrote that you wanted it began as an idea in 2017 for you, right? And you write that you want to tell the story of immigration in America through the prism of food. And I'm curious to know what it was like to go out and pitch this book to publishers, right?
Totally. Yeah.
Right? And what sort of pushback you might have gotten. And I'm particularly curious, did anyone try to say, Mayukh, why don't you just write a memoir?
Oh wow, they didn't. I think it's because I at least at that point in my life, I read to the world as like this 12-year-old kid, basically. So they were like, he's not ready for a memoir yet. But I did certainly get a lot of responses from publishers who said he should include recipes in this, in each chapter, and that is sort of a depressing but unsurprising response from publishers who feel as though who may feel as though, excuse me, food books can only have commercial viability if they do contain that essential service component, which is the bedrock of a lot of food writing. But I'm very much not a cook, and that's still the case 5 years, later after starting in this corner of the industry, that corner being food media. But yes, I did have the idea for this book in 2017, and at that point, I was a staff writer at a site called Food 52, which some viewers and listeners might be familiar with. And during that time, I had begun building a very small budding body of work of stories centered around figures from marginalized communities, like the ones I mentioned in that portion of the intro that I read. They're often women of color, immigrants of color, queer people, people who fell under all those umbrellas, and then a few more. And these were usually figures who had not been honored sufficiently in cultural memory. And I wanted to restore some dignity to their stories and do so with as much care as possible. And so a friend of mine suggested, oh, I wonder if there's a larger project in here tied to immigration. And I put that in my back pocket because I think I was 25 back then, and I did not feel ready to write a book. But a year later, I did. And in that time, between 2017 and 2018, I had noticed so many really disturbing to me narratives surrounding immigration and food within the food media. So many powerful institutions were peddling these talking points that essentially stated that immigrants feed America and immigrants get the job done. And those are totally well-intentioned talking points. And of course, they have a great degree of truth. Yet to me, to see those talking points coming from white-led institutions, it felt as though the reader whom the American food media has served for so long was being placated. And that was the white middle to upper middle class consumer. And the actual labor of immigrants themselves was being abstracted in that sort of configuration. And so I felt as though the best way for someone like me with my limited skill set as a storyteller to write against that impulse was to tell the stories of immigrants and honor their labor with as much care as possible, through a group biography format like this. So that's kind of where it began. But yeah, I mean, I did try to intentionally hit the road with this book, being as credentialed as I could be when I was 26. I made sure I got the right institutional recognition, nice hardware or whatever. And yet it was a challenge, because so many of those traditional food publishers looked at the absence of recipes and thought that this book did not have commercial viability. So I'm very, very fortunate to have ended up with a publisher who insisted that I have no recipes and understood, my voice and why, how I've been writing about food for the past few years. And I hope that it's smoother sailing for writers who follow me, especially those from marginalized communities.
Well, thank you for continuing to lay the groundwork for, folks coming after you. And I see Lily has popped onto the screen, which means we are onto our Q&A from the audience portion of the night. And Mayukh, thank you so much. I could talk to you, and I have so many questions. It's crazy. Please, folks, ask, because otherwise I'll just continue. So.
Thank you for your thoughtful questions.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Monique. And I would be very happy to hear both of you chat for just another few hours. I do have a couple of questions that came to me in the chat. And folks who are listening and watching, if there are questions that you want to ask Mayukh and Monique, you can send them to us through the chat. You can also put them in the Q&A box on your Zoom screen. So please do ask. But the first question, and this is, I think, really relevant to the workshop audience, many of whom are students, writers themselves, emerging writers. So I'd love to hear, what is your advice for writers who are wanting to explore a career in food writing? How would they get started?
Oh, yeah, I would say write for independent publications. There have been so many that have popped up over the past few years. And one very kind of example that I point to often is Whetstone magazine, which was founded by Steven Satterfield, whom many people may know as the host of Netflix's High on the Hog. But it is a really wonderful magazine where I truly feel decolonized food writing lives in a way that, few other mainstream food publications think to even accommodate. And I feel as though that is the path forward for food media. And what I tell my students at NYU all the time is that, you should, I understand the impulse to aspire to bylines in certain big national newspapers. And that is the path that I pursued because I wanted that validation, and it did open up access to capital and opportunity that otherwise would not be available to me just because of who I am and the communities that I belong to. Yet I see a different path forward for future generations in food media, and I would like to create a world in which the kind of locus of power in food media shifts away from these larger, usually white-led institutions that are broken beyond repair, and instead, I want to see that influence shift to these independent food publications that also do not bulldoze over your voice, because early in your career as a writer, it's so easy to just defer to the editor, that in a way that your own voice just completely disappears from the page, and you just want that byline and you want that very small paycheck that they will offer you. Yet I don't know that it's always worth it. And so I would say seek out publications like Whetstone as a place to really find your footing and begin, and understand that the only path for success in this industry is not going to be writing for that big newspaper or big glossy that everyone knows.
I love that. And it was Whetstone magazine, right?
Whetstone magazine, yeah.
Amazing. Thank you. A question from Amanda, which is actually related, I think, is can you describe your experiences with the publishing process as a storyteller amplifying immigrant food stories and cultures? And I know you both went into this a little bit already, but love to hear about the editing process. It was fascinating to me that your publisher was very happy to not move forward with any recipes, that they encouraged you not to include them. So if you could talk a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So my publisher is WW Norton and Company, and my editor is a wonderful woman named Melanie Tortoroli, and she edits mostly quite a lot of cookbooks, but she also does a lot of narrative nonfiction. And when she bid on my book, I knew I was in the right hands because there's so many other narrative nonfiction food books specifically that she had edited that there were no recipes in them, and they felt like truly radical works within the context of food media. So I was quite content and confident going into this experience. And I can say now on the other side, I feel the same way. Luckily, I really do feel as though my editor and I were quite simpatico in terms of the direction that I wanted to take this book in. And if anything, she was the one who really pushed me to make these larger arguments in this book, say about capitalism and the pressures that it puts upon immigrants and immigrant women in particular to survive in public and cultural memory. And I have a feeling that that's quite rare in terms of publishing experiences, because my understanding of food media is that it doesn't always accommodate to those of us whose politics are pretty far left. If anything, it's just barely left of center on a good day, the industry itself. So I'm grateful for that experience. And, I think throughout the process, if there was ever any pushback from my end in terms of any perceived slights, especially one kind of pertaining to me being a queer person of color writing this story, my concerns were heard, but that might be a rare experience, but I was quite content. I hope that answers your question. I feel like it might not.
I love that. It's so nice to hear that your editor was really on your team as well. That's really amazing. We love WW Norton. Amazing. This is related as well and kind of building on what you're talking about. The question is, as writers of color, and to both of you, I guess, as writers of color navigating the food and publishing industry, how did you find your people? How did you find your writing community?
That's a great question. Do you want to take this one first, Monique? Because I know this is to both of us, though, and I've been talking forever.
Well, I'll be happy to. I found my people at the Asian American Writers Workshop. I mean, really, I as the 30th anniversary is this year, I've been thinking back about how it really is for me my MFA. I mean, I I'm a refugee. I I didn't even really felt I didn't I didn't have the capacity, I think, to think of doing something as it felt extravagant, I have to tell you, to get an MFA. I was like, I'm a lawyer too. That's what I went and did, right? And so for me, the AAWW was really where I learned about what it would be like to do basic things like how do you how do you get how do you apply for a writing residency? How do you even begin to think about getting an agent? How do you pay your bills when you don't have a steady income? And I was meeting all these folks who basically had exactly that experience, and a lot of them also were like me, who also had this other kind of very structured professional life? And how do you transition? How do you, actually try to find happiness? So that's how I found, my tribe is what I think of the workshop. But
That's beautiful. Thank
I
you.
wish I had found it at AAWW, I do think that these sorts of spaces, like, another that comes to mind is Kundiman, for example, which I've had the great fortune of working so closely with. I've met so many incredibly talented writers, and I think that we all want to see each other succeed. So I would say look out for those sorts of spaces because I think that is where the most productive kind of uh, solidarity building, so to speak, happens. Because my initial response to this question was like, I found a lot of my friends on Twitter, but Twitter is an incredibly ugly place. And, sometimes you do bond through mutually terrible experiences that you have on that site. Yet I don't want any younger writer to experience that. So
Come
Monique.
to the workshop, come to Kundiman, definitely. I am conscious that we're almost at the end of our hour, so I have one more question, and then actually, Monique, I want to give the last question to you to kind of close out our night. But a question that we always ask our writers is just to sort of call absent friends into this space. I'd love to hear from you, Mayukh. Are there food writers, scholars, just writers in general? Are there chefs? Are there restaurants that you just want to name and kind of recommend to our audience? I love to just kind of end on that note.
Yes, absolutely. And sorry, wait, was this for me or was it for Monique? I'm sorry.
And both of you, but I'd love you to start.
Okay, cool. Well, a few, food writers who come to mind. One is Alicia Kennedy, and full disclosure, she's a good friend of mine, but she's really blown up over the past year, deservedly. Another is Vidya Balachander. She is the South Asia editor of Whetstone magazine, and her work is just immaculate. It's so superbly researched. Another is Sharanya Deepak. I can drop that into the chat as well. She's also another really, really fabulous food writer, but those are a few names come to mind immediately.
Amazing. Thank you for those recommendations. Monique, do you want to share any names? And then I'll turn the mic over to you to ask one last question.
Oh, wow. Lily, my memory is terrible, and you should never do this to someone who's older, like 50 or older, like me, because we can't recall names very quickly. But
you're welcome to pass.
but I kind of feel like I'm amazed that Mayukh was able to even sort of narrow down a couple of names, because I feel like everyone, I want to like bring everyone into this space with us, because really, like, how we began this discussion, right, Mayukh, collective labor, it is so antithetical to this, to what capitalism does best, which is to create a product, right? Your book is a product, but you, Mayukh Sen, become a product, and as if there was, not a host of people who came together, including your parents, who created you,
Yep.
and kept you going until this moment, until this book, right? So that is my non-response response. But I want to end by asking Mayukh, maybe this is almost an impossible question, but if you could just share what you hope your readers will take from Tastemaker.
Absolutely. I would say that, my suspicion is that many people will pick up this book wondering how America became this so-called culinary melting pot. And they would want to know how it is that this country is a place where in major metropolitan areas, you can find so many different world cuisines on the span of one block. Yet I want my readers to understand that that reality for consumers involved so much struggle in terms of the labor of immigrant women in particular, like the ones I want to honor in this book, because it is so easy to look at that reality for consumers and view it as this sort of American ideal. Yet I want people to see the struggle embedded in that. So that's what I hope they take away from Tastemakers.
Thank you.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much. I love ending on that note. So it will just sort of fall to me to give a bunch of thanks to thank our audience for joining us on Zoom this evening, to thank Mayukh for this beautiful book. My colleague just put a bunch of links in the chat. Please do go and buy this from Books Are Magic, who are one of our favorite indie bookstores, and a local to New York at least bookseller. Thank you, Monique, for so generously guiding us through this conversation this evening. It has been such an enormous pleasure to sit and listen to both of you chat on my screen. And I want to make sure to thank Pro Bono ASL as always. I want to thank Chris, who's on screen now, and Jenna, who was on screen earlier. Thank you both, and thanks to Pro Bono ASL for making our events accessible. Yeah, this has been a pleasure. Thank you both.
Thank you all so much, the entire team, and thank you, audience, for wonderful discussion.
Thank you so much. We will see you all again soon, and hopefully next year in person at the workshop. We will have conversations there. So thank you so much. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening.